So in this video, I wanted to go into, I think my last one was on demons, and the other one before that was on miracles and the evidence of miracles in both the Bible and the ancient world and today's world, with Craig Keener's book about miracles happening today. We went into evidence, even a scientific peer-reviewed paper that mentioned it and happening in Africa. Here I wanted to actually go into a very interesting topic, I think, which is what is the evidence, if there is any, as some would say. What is the evidence that the Bible, as Christians believe, is, quote, inspired by God? And what does that even mean? Like, what does it mean to say we believe it's inspired by God? Does it mean we believe it's infallible because God is behind it? I would say to that, yes. But as with God, things are always more complicated than they appear. Anyone who believes in God, like the real one, only God, ultimate God, I mean, logically, the thing is, if God exists, as I believe so, then then by definition, in order to be God, in order to be truly above everything, like nothing you can possibly imagine is superior to him in any way, well, then he transcends everything necessarily. And that includes even human logic. That includes even he can involve paradoxes, because by definition he would have to, if he be God, basically. And I have no problem believing that, because it's very easy to see how we humans have limitations. So, no human being is omniscient. If we were, we'd be God. So we're not God, which means we're ignorant. We we literally can't know everything, no matter how hard we try to. We're intelligent creatures endowed with free will and reason, so we can, come to believe in some true things and learn new things, but we can never have everything. That's only reserved for God, by definition. And I take that belief of mine into also the fact that I believe the Bible's inspired. And there was a time in my Christian life that I doubted that too. If you know C.S. Lewis, who was a famous Christian apologist, wrote the Narnia books, which are clearly based off, clearly paralleling Jesus and the early church in the Narnia books. Aslan, is basically Jesus. Well, C.S. Lewis didn't believe the Bible was, I think, infallible or inspired. I want to say maybe he believed it was inspired, but I know he definitely didn't believe it was infallible. And, which is also why I'd say, because in my view, it's C.S. Lewis was definitely a Christian. There are some doctrines too, I would say, as a Christian, I would say a conservative Christian, I'd call myself. Not all doctrines are necessarily, are necessary for, I would say, salvation, for, believing in Jesus, going to heaven versus hell. And I believe in hell too, just as much as I believe in heaven. Jesus talks actually more about hell than he talks about heaven, is what's interesting when you read the Gospels. So, not all doctrines are necessary for salvation. However, they're all important in my view, and some are necessary. For instance, Paul lays it out in one of his letters where he says, believe Jesus is Lord, and that he rose, that he died for your sins and resurrected on the third day. There's a clear, doctrinal thing that's still expected, which is fine. I mean, in my view, beliefs, your beliefs inform your actions, and they really do become part of your character, I would say too, and become part of your identity. It actually really starts with your beliefs. You can believe by, what do we mean by beliefs? Some people just always interpret that religiously, but it's no, at the end of the day, it really just comes to what conclusions have you drawn about life, the universe, everything. What conclusions have you made that you follow in your day-to-day lifestyle? That's really what beliefs are. Belief is just another word for that, which is why I would say when it comes to religion, yes, it is just as important to believe in objectivity and that some views are wrong and some views are not. That's true in religion, it's true in politics, and it's true everywhere in life. And I would say it's even more important in religion, because if Christianity is true, then not only is it true and the other religions are not true, but it is the most important truth of life. The same would be true of Islam and Judaism. Now, what I find interesting, though, I've studied a lot of religions, both today and in ancient times, medieval times. You know, people like to say that every religion claims it's the truth, but that's actually not true. That's objectively not true. There's very few religions that actually claim to have the truth. I would say the three Abrahamic ones, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, but a lot of like the spiritual New Age faiths, a lot of secular type of lives like humanism, all of these ideas, Buddhism, Hinduism even. When I read the Bhagavad Gita and, you know, debated with Hindus as well, like, they all have a very relativistic idea where it's like, well, I mean, we're not actually claiming it's true. Like, there could be the whole idea of like, there's many truths, which is a truth statement, ironically. Like, you're saying objectively that there's many truths. That is your objective belief if you believe that. Which is why it's like, again, that alone already compels me towards the Abrahamic faiths, because in my view, that has to be the truth. Just like everywhere in life, there has to be a true belief and a wrong belief. It's considered mean for some reason to say that in religion, but not anywhere else in life. And I'm not saying this out of any kind of malice or contempt. Like, I'm sure I have a lot of wrong beliefs. I'm sure God one day will correct me and say, Ben, you have some stupid beliefs over here. But here's the beautiful thing in Christianity, which still claims it has the truth and the others are wrong. Well, what is that ultimate truth, though, on the cross with Jesus is also that we have grace. And that includes that it covers, I would say it covers a lot of our ignorance too. A lot of our incorrect beliefs, because God knows, and we are living after paradise lost in Genesis. We are fallen, ignorant creatures that will never be able to come to the complete truth about everything. That's also why I would say when you read like other religious literature and you read like First Enoch, when we went into demons, for instance, and fallen angels, and it's like, why don't they get forgiveness? And it's like, well, because they know way more than we do. Like, they are certain about everything in ways that we are not. And because of that, it's very much the same thing today in law, where like when someone is guilty of something, do you genuinely regret what you did, or are you just sorry you got caught? And that's really the sorry you got caught and being fearful of the consequences is what actually describes demons on earth and fallen angels. As we went into, we distinguished those. Actually, I think they're different creatures entirely, actually. But yeah, that's what it gets down to. Anyway, let's finally get to the actual point. As usual, I go on many tangents. So what do I believe when I say the Bible's inspired? I believe God in some way, just I can't describe how necessarily, but in some way he is the author of the Bible, in the sense that his spirit was behind the human scribes, the human canonical, the church coming to the canon of the Bible with how it currently exists for us. That God, yes, he used humans. He used the human process. He used even scientific and historical processes involved in the creation of the Bible. But God is still involved in that. And the end product, the completely end product is whatever the originals. We don't actually have the originals for, I think, either all or most of the texts. But yes, those are infallible in the way that God doesn't make mistakes, I believe, either. So either it's a result of if we see a possible mistake, I think usually we can actually figure out it's not a mistake when we, read context, understand history in the time, all that sort of things can help. But even some things where it's really hard to know that, I would say, well, it could be up to just our own human misinterpretation maybe a human scribe along the way did get something wrong and we don't actually read the perfect like text. It's very hard to say. I'll fully admit that as a Christian. But now let's get into the evidence, because I do believe, this is why I still believe, like I doubted it initially, but I unlike C.S. Lewis, I'm like, I'm not gonna throw the baby out with the bathwater. No, there's a reason still that I believe in these books and not other books, and there is evidence for the inspiration of the Bible, because the Bible is one giant story, right? And authors write stories. So when we say God wrote the Bible or God inspired the Bible, God is behind the Bible. Another way of saying that is God is the big author, the big A author of the Bible. There is an author within the Bible that transcends the individual human authors that, yes, brought their own biases and cultures to the text in ways that I think are actually good, that give us more confidence. It really just helps us, just like how Jesus represents God taking physical form and coming into the mess on earth to live like one of us. Well, it's similar with the Bible, like God uses the mess of human transmission and human processes in the ancient world too, to give us a perfect text from his own creation. Like he doesn't shy from going into the, just like the king stepping from the throne, going into the mess with us. And boy, you want to talk about Jesus though, or you read the Old Testament as we're in right now. I love reading the Old Testament. The Old Testament is filled with crazy stories, but just fully going into the mess again. But yeah, the Bible from start to finish is far more a narrative. It really is a story, which is, I would say, contrasted with Islam, because if you read the Quran, it's really just a command. Basically, it's like saying, this is, we'll go briefly into one of my disputes with Islam. I've had many arguments with Muslims too about this. And I could hear the counter argument that maybe Christianity says the same thing, but really Christianity, when you read it, is meant to be a fulfillment of Judaism. That's what it's entailing. That is the faith. Is the Messiah has come now. The Old Testament is still valid, but also, well, not valid in the same way it used to be. Now we have the New Testament. Like it is truly a new belief, or not really, new and old at the same time, if you know what I'm saying. Because the point is, Jesus was in the Old Testament, but then we see the fullness of it when he comes on earth. That's the New Testament and the New Covenant, the grace that we have now. Now, what is Islam? Islam at its roots is just saying the other faiths are wrong. And that's its only thing. Like Muslims, they actually believe Jesus is the Messiah. The Quran says he is the Messiah. That's what I never understand. It's like the Quran actually says he's the Messiah. But when you read the Quran and you read the early history of Islam, the whole purpose to it is just simply to say that Christians and Jews are wrong. Like that actually is what caused the creation of Islam, is just to say the other faiths were wrong. Which is, in my view, is one of the biggest reasons that it's wrong. That's why I'm not Muslim. It's like, that's its whole purpose, is to only debate and only say you're wrong and I'm right. Now some hearing the counter arguments like, well, aren't you saying that too, Ben, with Christianity? It's like, yes, in a sense, but that's not the whole point. That's my part. But Islam, that is the whole point. It's just to say the other faiths are wrong. Like Muhammad came just to say Christians and Jews are wrong, but yes, they're right about other things. So now here's what you're actually supposed to believe. So believe this. And Jesus, in the New Testament and Christianity came to say that too about Jews at the time and the Pharisees. But it was so much more than that. It was about him being the Messiah and him fulfilling the scriptures. And like, he's not simply throwing out old things. And like you could say Islam says that too. It's not throwing out everything. My whole point is just that Islam kind of defines itself by just dispute. Whereas Christianity defines itself by, well, Jesus ultimately and the fulfillment of of our hopes and dreams within the Judaism scriptures. So, once again, another side note about that. So now we'll finally end with the actual evidence. There's so many other stories I go into. This is one that I just personally, I'm not saying I alone discovered this. I am saying I personally, on my own though, can't realize this. Whether it's been pointed out by other Christians in the past, I'm sure it has. But this is when I read this and it's like, you just can't make these things up. So when we read, we're in 1 Samuel right now. This is King Saul, the first king of Israel. And as you see here, there was a man from Benjamin. It goes on. I'm not going to really get too deep into the words here. A lot of Christians already know this story, and I think some non-Christians know it too. I just want to give you the details, though, because the details are what's important. So Saul becomes king of Israel, and then when he winds up falling into pride, sin, disobedience towards God, and God rejects him, and that leads to David, where the very prophet who prophesied Saul, well, Samuel was the prophet, then tells him that the Lord's rejected you. David's going to be the new guy. And Saul, remember, Saul's from the tribe of Benjamin too. Saul goes on a campaign basically to persecute and eliminate David and his followers by fiat, because David's hiding with all of his followers constantly from Saul. Saul trying to persecute them all, but ultimately going after David himself. That's what Saul winds up doing. Now remember, Saul, tribe of Benjamin, going after David. Now let's go to a familiar face, the Apostle Paul, also known as the Apostle, well, not the Apostle, but Saul. Saul was people say his original name. His name actually never changed. It's just Paul. When you read Acts of the Apostles, it starts by describing him as Saul. And then even when he becomes Christian, it still describes him as Saul. But then when he becomes part of, I think when it's transitioning into him ministering to the Gentiles, that Saul's calling is to actually reach Gentiles, reach non-Jews. That's when the name changes its spelling from Saul to Paul, because Paul is the better Greek rendering of his name. So that's really why his name changes, is because he starts ministering to Greeks more. And so the writer of Acts, who I believe is Luke, his follower, then changes how he spells his name later on, just so subtly from Saul to Paul. I think some people believe he changed his name when he became a Christian. That's actually not what happens. He was Saul from beginning to end, basically. It doesn't really matter much. The whole point is that, yes, his original name, yes, was Saul. This is Saul, not just Paul. So Saul, same name, describes his history over here. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I am more circumcised. I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law. This is Paul going into his history about, and what do we know about Paul? Well, his name was Saul, and in his own words, in his own letter, he says quite casually too, not even in his own words, trying to connect it to the Old Testament, saying he is from the tribe of Benjamin, that's where he was raised to, and where he descended. Now, what do we know about Jesus? Well, Jesus, according to the Gospels, what I believe too, that again, this is when the historical evidence for certain things doesn't actually matter, because it does, but if anything, I would consider this more evidence to believe the historical claims too, because this is evidence the Bible itself is inspired. So Jesus, we're told many times later on in the Gospels and in his ancestry, is from David's line. That is the Messiah. He's the son of David, the descendant of David. Now, I will say it doesn't directly say Saul is directly the descendant of Saul, but the connection is obvious. He has the same name and he's from the same tribe. And what happens with Saul? He is someone who is initially very much believing in the law, the Torah. You could say similar again to how Saul became king of Israel. And initially, Saul, king of Israel, was very good too. He was a very good king until he fell into pride and sought to disobey God, which led to David and led to him persecuting David. You see the exact same thing play out in Paul's story, where he starts to persecute the church, the followers of Jesus. And even when he converts, he has his Damascus Road experience. He's on the road, got letters from his Pharisee friends to go persecute, round up the Christians in Damascus. And that's on the road where Jesus, now in his resurrected form, appears to Saul directly and says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why do you persecute me?" That's in Acts. Saul mentions him. Paul mentions it. It's the same guy. Paul mentions it too in Galatians. And by the way, this is important historically. No scholar disputes that Paul actually did write Galatians and this one, Philippians. No one disputes that Paul wrote that verse. Most scholars, Christians and non-Christians, agree that Paul, the actual Paul, wrote Philippians and Galatians. And as I was saying, you just can't make this stuff up. Like, we have like a literal parallel between the Old Testament Saul persecuting David and his followers and the New Testament Saul persecuting Jesus and his followers from the line of David. Saul being in the same name from the line of Benjamin, the same as the King Saul in the Old Testament. And I could hear the argument saying, well, the writers just were deliberately doing that. I'm like, well, that works for like when you have like from one text to one text, because yeah, there's no question they're aware of these things. But like this requires my point is this would require an actual conspiracy to believe, because the writer of Acts, all scholars would agree though, whether they believe it's Luke or not, was not Paul. And yet Paul, in his letters, ever so casually too, in a letter to the church, drops that he's from the tribe of Benjamin. And yet the story of him persecuting the church, once again, that is a fact most scholars believe, because Paul brings it up routinely in his letters. It's brought up later in other non-biblical letters from the same churches too, written to the same churches. It's mentioned, of course, in Acts. There's like no reason historically either to doubt that actually happened with Paul's situation. And regardless, it's like the connection is so clear. Acts does not mention that Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. Saul himself does in an entirely separate source. That's what you have to remember. The Bible was compiled later. All of the New Testaments, all these letters in the first century were separate, their own historical separate documents. And yet we can find this parallel by connecting entirely separate documents, times, and authors. And yet we see the so obvious, spiritual parallel that's going on here. So to me, it's like that's evidence of, yes, an author, it's a spiritual connection we can see. So it's evidence that there is another author going on in the Bible. And that's just one. I've heard other Christian friends bring up other things that they've noticed. I actually think you can probably write a whole essay of connections like this, and an essay where you can explain all the connections and explain how also the secular interpretation that this is just writers referring to the other writers because they had knowledge of them just doesn't work. Because again, these are entirely independent independent claims and independent sources that are somehow conglomerating together. Now you could say, well, didn't Paul know Luke? But what are you saying? You're trying to say that the only other alternative is a big conspiracy, a very well done conspiracy. They connived with each other in the shadows to say, oh, Paul, we're going to say you're from the tribe of Benjamin, right? Because we're going to deliberately, even though they never mentioned this connection at all, they're like, we're going to deliberately, instill this connection in these new converts. that you're like imitating Saul in the Old Testament. And just remember, Paul, that you got to remember when you write to the Philippian church to just mention that you're from the tribe of Benjamin. Like, trying to imagine that, it's like, I'm sorry, it's absurd. It is a case where the secular interpretation, to me, the secular explanation is more fantastical than the supernatural one. Like, I believe sometimes that's the case, where a natural explanation sounds more ridiculous than a supernatural one. And this is a case right there. Anyway, that's my views. I say it all again with love. I love all you. I really do. I mean, I want everyone to believe in the end, because it's the most important thing in life, I would say. Life is so short. We all know that. Everyone's trying, there's mad scientists right now trying to come up with an elixir of life that will always fail as it has in the past. As Solomon said in Ecclesiastes in the Bible again, God has planted eternity in the human heart. That is so obviously true. And I'll say, like, one last point, going back to, how I believe that because of that, like, truth matters, doctrine still matters. Well, when you read Revelations, Jesus has 7 letters to 7 churches at the beginning. Revelation was actually written as a letter. Like, it's an apocalyptic vision, that's true, but the genre is actually a letter. John is writing this as a letter to various churches saying, hey, I saw this. Jesus told me these things. Jesus and angels showed me these things. He wants me to let you know this. And what I find interesting is, when you read the beginning of Revelation, there are 2 churches that Jesus has issues with. One of them is, and they're basically 2 sides of the same coin. And I would say the same is true today. Of what the first one he has an issue with is what is like a modern example, I would say, of a church that is very much the fundamentalists, the hardcore, like, my way or the highway about every single little thing. Jesus, in this verse, he's praising this church for getting doctrine right, for saying, yes, that is important. That's something I'm pleased with you about, sticking to, like, making sure you're sticking to your guns on what is really the truth. But then Jesus says, but I have this to pick with you. You're not showing love to people. You're not actually loving others as you should, which is the whole point of it. Like, this is the end goal too, is to love others as well. And because of that, you have to correct, like, you're not good you're not in my favor until you correct this, is what Jesus says. Now, immediately, one of the very next churches that John mentions that Jesus told him that Jesus has an issue with is the reverse of that, which is, decades ago, I'd say the issue was more that church. Now it's more the reverse church. And they're both basically wrong wrong in different ways. This is when Jesus says that he has an issue with the church. He praises it for what he condemned the other church for, saying, I have to commend you for how much love you show other people and hospitality you show other people. Yes, you should absolutely be doing that. But then he turns around and says, however, you've welcomed a heretic in the church who is now leading other people astray from the real truth, and for that I condemn, and you're not in my favor. Like, none of you are in my favor until you correct this part of your church. You still need to get, yes, dogma right too. That's still important. So I always say, it's like, the Bible seems very clear on both things about the truth. And as I was saying, doctrine is just another way of just like, I don't even know if I really like that word, because people use it so as a religious term, but it's just something we do everywhere in life, which is why it is important. So am I saying that, like, more spiritually relativistic churches today? Like, I am not like a fundamentalist, I would say. I'm non-denominational. I've never really subscribed to a denomination because, like I said, I don't believe all doctrines are important necessarily for salvation. They're all important because all truth is important, and it's great and interesting and fascinating to dispute these topics with each other. But we also have to remember that there's core truths, that is the most important things. But also we have to remember that, yes, those are the most important things, because a lot of spiritualists today want to discount all of it and say, oh yeah, we can do everything. You know, our church is just like, you come here and it's basically a therapy session. And all I can say is like, why not just go to therapy? Like, what do you offer that a therapy session wouldn't? What's the purpose of your existence then? Anyway, that's a whole other argument, but this conclusion, I was thinking about what I said in the beginning of the video, reminded me of that. But yeah, I'm at 30 minutes now, so as usual, I came to this video thinking I'd keep it to 15, 20 minutes. As usual, it always runs over because I just rant so much about everything. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Again, if you disagree, if you bring it up too in comments or whatever, it's fine. You know, I may reply, I may not, depending on what I'm doing right now. But yep, you all have a great day.